The midday sun blazed with unrelenting intensity over the streets of a small but bustling town in Burkina Faso. Dust swirled through the air, kicked up by the roar of motorcycle engines that echoed through the narrow alleys. The thunderous rumble of engines mixed with raucous laughter created an atmosphere of menace that hung heavy in the afternoon heat. The town of Calaten had once been peaceful, known for its vibrant markets where women sold colorful fabrics and fresh produce, where children played soccer in dusty courtyards, and where elders gathered under baobab trees to share stories and wisdom. But over the past year, everything had changed. The Road Kings, led by the ruthless Benjol, had transformed the streets into their personal domain, extorting money from shop owners, terrorizing families, and creating an atmosphere of fear that poisoned the very air. People quickly changed their routes, pulling down shop shutters with trembling hands and dragging their children inside their homes. Everyone knew what was coming. If these thugs caught you in their path today, trouble was inevitable. The town had learned to recognize the signs of their arrival: the distant growl of engines, the cloud of dust on the horizon, the sudden silence that fell over the marketplace as vendors hurriedly covered their goods and retreated into the shadows. In this tense atmosphere, a solitary figure stood resolute at the gate of the military headquarters. Lieutenant Alia, her face composed but her eyes burning with the fire of revolution. Wrapped in green camouflage fatigues, a green beret perched firmly on her head, she surveyed her territory with unwavering vigilance. Behind her, the flag of Burkina Faso rippled in the warm breeze, and above the gate, bold letters proclaimed honor, discipline, sacrifice. Alia had grown up in a small village north of Calaten, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a nurse. From childhood, she had watched her mother tend to the sick without regard for their ability to pay, and her father educate children whose parents could barely afford books. They had instilled in her a profound sense of duty to her community and her nation. When she announced at 17 that she would join the military, her father had placed his hand on her head and said, "Serve with honor, my daughter. Let your actions speak louder than any words." Those words had become her compass. Now, at 26, she had risen to the rank of lieutenant through sheer determination and unwavering commitment to excellence. She had faced discrimination and doubt. Many had questioned whether a woman belonged in uniform. But she had proven herself time and again, earning the respect of her fellow soldiers through her skill, her courage, and her unshakable moral compass. Alia stood at her guard post when a thunderous roar suddenly filled the air. Dozens of motorcycles appeared, their riders young men wielding iron pipes, their chests covered in tattoos, their voices dripping with arrogance and contempt. They moved like a swarm of locusts, consuming everything in their path with their noise and violence. One of them shouted above the din, "Clear the way! Burkina Faso belongs to us!" Another revved his engine, having deliberately broken off his silencer to maximize the noise. Clouds of dust rose like a desert storm, obscuring the sun itself. The air filled with the acrid smell of exhaust fumes and burning rubber. Alia's brow furrowed in determination. She had known this confrontation was coming. For weeks, the Road Kings had been growing bolder, their attacks more frequent, their victims more vulnerable. Just last week, they had beaten an elderly shopkeeper who refused to pay their protection fee. The man now lay in hospital, his family devastated, his shop destroyed. Alia had visited him there, had seen the fear in his children's eyes, and had made a silent vow that this would end. She stepped forward, raising her hand in an authoritative gesture, and spoke in a firm, commanding tone. "This area is a defense zone. Stop your vehicles immediately!" But their laughter only grew louder, more mocking. A young man at the front sneered and shouted, "A woman soldier? Ha! She thinks she can stop us?" That single sentence became a spark. In one fluid motion, Alia grabbed a rubber baton from the guard post. As a motorcycle sped past her, she moved with lightning speed and precision. The baton connected squarely with the rider's arm. He lost his balance instantly and crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust and twisted metal. Someone from the back yelled, "Leave her alone!" But before anyone could react, Alia struck again. And then again. 3 riders lay sprawled on the ground, groaning in pain and confusion. The rest of the gang momentarily froze, stunned by this unexpected resistance. They had terrorized this town for so long, faced so little opposition that this defiance seemed impossible. Her voice cut through the dust-filled air like a blade. This city belongs to no gang. It belongs to the law. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Several motorcycles turned around, their riders retreating. But about 15 young men remained, defiant and angry. From among them emerged a particularly imposing figure, tall, bearded, with bloody tattoos covering his muscular arms. His leather jacket bore the words "Road Kings" in bold letters. This was Benjol, the most dangerous gang leader in the city. Benjol had built his empire through violence and intimidation. Born into poverty, he had watched his father struggle and fail, had seen his mother work herself to exhaustion for pennies. Somewhere along the way, he had decided that power was the only currency that mattered. He had gathered around him other young men, angry, disillusioned, hungry for respect they couldn't earn honestly. Together they had created a kingdom of fear. He laughed, clapping his hands mockingly. "Impressive! A woman has knocked down my man. But remember this, you've bruised my pride, and I don't let anyone who bruises my pride live to tell the tale." Alia's gaze remained locked on his eyes, unwavering. She could see the rage building in him, but she also saw something else, a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected fear, but she gave him only steely resolve. "This country is not your playground, and your reign of terror ends now." Benjol put on his helmet with a taunting smile. "Very well, soldier. We'll see tomorrow then. Let's find out what wins, law or fear." He mounted his motorcycle and disappeared in a storm of dust and exhaust fumes, his gang following behind him like a retreating army. Alia took a deep breath. Her hands were steady, but her heart was pounding. She knew this was just the beginning. But in her heart, a certainty had awakened. This battle is not about the streets. It's about the honor of our nation. She closed her report book, looked up at the sky, and said quietly, "If he returns, it won't just be the uniform that speaks. Burkina Faso itself will answer." That night, dim lights burned in the headquarters. Soldiers stood alert at their posts, sensing the tension that hung in the air like an approaching storm. Alia knew this silence was the calm before a greater tempest. She sat in her quarters, cleaning her weapon with methodical precision, thinking about the young men she had faced today. How had they come to this? What failures of society, what disappointments and betrayals had turned them into instruments of terror? She believed in justice, but she also believed in redemption. If there was a way to save them, to bring them back into the light, she would find it. Night had fallen deep and heavy over Kalatin. On the outskirts of the city, an old warehouse stood shrouded in darkness. Rainwater dripped from the ceiling through rusted holes, and shadows of bats flickered across the crumbling walls. The building had once been a textile factory, providing employment to dozens of families. But economic hardship and corruption had closed it years ago, leaving behind only this hollow shell that now served as headquarters for the Road Kings. Inside, around oil drums that served as makeshift tables, approximately 30 young men sat immersed in alcohol, defeat, and burning anger. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap liquor. Scattered around the floor were empty bottles, discarded food wrappers and weapons, chains, pipes, clubs, even a few stolen guns. In the center, sitting on a wooden crate like a throne, was that same man, Benjol, who had been humiliated that very day by a woman soldier in front of everyone. The shame burned hotter than any fire. His reputation, carefully built through years of violence and intimidation, had been damaged in mere minutes. He could already imagine the whispers spreading through the city, the laughter behind closed doors, the erosion of the fear that kept his empire intact. Benjol held a half-empty bottle in his hand. He took a long gulp, the alcohol burning down his throat but doing nothing to cool his rage. Then he hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the warehouse as he roared, "Today, our honor was dragged through the mud! The city is laughing at us. A woman commanded authority over us. I cannot tolerate this." A young man stepped forward nervously. His name was Malik, and unlike many of the others, he had joined the gang not out of malice but desperation. His family was starving, and the gang provided money. But he had never enjoyed the violence, had never lost his conscience entirely. "Brother, she's a soldier. If we take revenge, the army will come down on us hard." Benjol's eyes turned bloodshot with rage. He screamed, "Whether it's the army or the government, no one has the courage to stand in Benjol's way. Tomorrow at noon, we'll teach her a lesson in front of everyone." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on his face, waiting for his next words. Some of the younger boys looked frightened. They had signed up for petty theft and intimidation, not war with the military. But fear of Benjol kept them silent. He spoke in a lower but more menacing tone. "We won't attack in secret. We'll do it in broad daylight so the whole city can see that no woman or soldier can stand against Benjol. We'll send a message that will echo through every street in Burkina Faso," one of his companions asked. "But she won't be alone. There are dozens of soldiers at headquarters." Benjol slammed a knife into the table, the blade quivering with the force of the impact. "We need to find an opportunity. She goes on patrol every afternoon. This time she'll be alone. We've been watching her routine for days. Tomorrow she'll take the western route. It's isolated. Perfect for our purposes." In the corner of the room sat a younger boy with a silver chain hanging from his neck. His name was Ibrahim, not related to the general, but named after him by parents who had hoped their son would grow up to serve his country with honor. Instead, he had fallen in with this gang at 15, seduced by the promise of easy money and respect. He spoke up. "Brother, how many of us will go?" Benjol answered, 20 motorcycles, iron chains, metal rods, and one old bike to run her down directly. No mercy. We'll beat her in front of witnesses, make sure everyone with a phone records it. Let the whole country see what happens to those who challenge us." Everyone erupted in enthusiastic shouts, though many were fueled more by alcohol and bravado than genuine conviction. The warehouse echoed with voices. "Long live Benjol!" Benjol smiled darkly. "When she falls to the ground, I'll stand over her myself and say, 'This country was made for men only.'" He had no idea that the honor he was about to trample was actually a challenge to the very conscience of Burkina Faso. He didn't understand that in targeting Alia, he was attacking not just one woman, but a symbol of everything his nation aspired to be. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Lieutenant Alia was examining files in her office. The small room was neat and organized, with maps on the walls and stacks of carefully maintained reports. Her assistant, Corporal Fatima, reported, "Ma'am, some boys have been throwing stones at the western wall. It appears to be the same gang. They're testing us, seeing how we'll respond." Alia smiled, but her voice remained firm. "They think I'll be frightened. Now, this isn't just about discipline. It's about the honor of our homeland. They need to understand that when they attack one of us, they attack all of us." This time, she didn't reach for the rubber baton. Instead, she gripped her service weapon, checking its mechanism with the ease of long practice. But in her heart, she whispered a prayer. "Oh God, if I must stand today, don't let my weakness show. Give me the strength to do what is right, no matter the cost." The night passed slowly. Alia slept fitly, her dreams filled with images of conflict and resolution. Morning arrived, and on the surface, the city appeared peaceful. Market vendors set up their stalls, children walked to school, men departed for work. But an unknown tension floated in the air, a collective holding of breath. In the alleyways, those same boys moved quietly into position. From somewhere distant came the rumble of motorcycle engines being started, tuned, prepared. On Benjol's orders, everyone was ready. This would be the day that determined who truly controlled Kalatin, the law or the lawless. Inside headquarters, soldiers went about their daily duties, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond their walls. Ibrahim Traoré, who was supervising his unit at that moment, sat among his files when a soldier rushed in with quick steps. "General, sir, suspicious activity has been spotted in the city again. It's likely the same gang. They're gathering near the Western District." Traoré rose from his chair, his imposing figure casting a long shadow. At 53, he had served his country for over 3 decades. He had witnessed coups and counter-coups, had seen governments rise and fall, but through it all, He had maintained his integrity. He believed deeply that the military existed to serve the people, not to dominate them. His soldiers loved him not because he was soft, he was demanding and expected excellence, but because he led by example and never asked them to face anything he wouldn't face himself. If they've returned, the army will not remain silent this time. I'll lead the response myself, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of command. Elsewhere, Benjol sat astride his motorcycle in the warehouse, surrounded by his assembled force. Sunlight glinted in his eyes as he roared, "Today will be Benjol's victory, and that woman will fall. Today, we remind this city who holds the real power." The atmosphere of the city began to tremble. The moment was approaching when law and barbarism would face each other, and the outcome remained uncertain. Noon had arrived with its customary intensity. The sun stood directly overhead, and the heat was so intense that the streets seemed to shimmer with rising vapors. The air carried that particular silence that descends before a storm, heavy, oppressive, and full of foreboding. Even the birds had gone quiet, seeking shelter in whatever shade they could find. Lieutenant Aliyah had set out on patrol in the western sector, alone. She usually traveled with 2 soldiers, but today she had insisted on going by herself. She could feel in her heart that some test was coming, and she didn't want to endanger others. Her decision was controversial. Her colleagues had argued against it, but she had been firm. This was her responsibility, her calling. She had never backed down from a challenge, and she wouldn't start now. The sound of her boots echoed through the deserted alleys. Every step was measured, every corner carefully observed. Her hand never strayed far from her weapon. The Western District was older, with narrow passages between crumbling buildings, perfect for an ambush. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability, but she moved forward with determined purpose. Suddenly, from the distance, the sound of motorcycle engines began to emerge. First one, then 2, and then it seemed as if an entire army was approaching. The sound grew louder, more menacing, echoing off the walls and amplifying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon. From around the bend appeared approximately 20 motorcycles, moving in formation like a military unit. The riders wore helmets that obscured their faces, wielded chains in their hands, carried iron rods across their shoulders. At the very front rode Benjol, that same savage smile on his face, like oil being poured on fire. He roared, "Look at this, boys! This is the woman who crushed Benjol's pride beneath her feet. Today she learns her place." The others broke their silences deliberately. The noise was so tremendous that birds fled from the trees in panic and windows rattled in their frames. The sound echoed off the walls, creating a cacophony of mechanical violence designed to intimidate and terrify. Aliyah closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself. She thought of her parents, of the villagers who had believed in her, of every girl in Burkina Faso who dreamed of being more than society expected. Then she opened her eyes and straightened the barrel of her gun, speaking with absolute authority. "This area belongs to the military. If you take one more step forward, the law will bury you in the ground." Benjol laughed mockingly, though there was an edge to it now. "Law? Today's law will be written in your blood, woman." The first attack came without warning. A motorcycle accelerated toward her at breakneck speed, the rider leaning forward with clear intent to run her down. Aliyah leaped aside at the last second to save herself, her military training taking over. But she fell hard to the ground, the impact driving the air from her lungs. In that instant of vulnerability, chains came whipping through the air like metal serpents. An iron rod struck her shoulder with brutal force. Another hit her leg. She cried out in pain, but didn't release her weapon, her fingers locked around the grip with desperate determination. She took aim and fired a shot into the air. The sound was so loud that for a moment everything froze. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed through the district, and for a heartbeat the attackers hesitated. "Stop this!" someone shouted, perhaps Malik, his conscience finally breaking through. But Benjol pulled out a knife, waving it in the air. "Kill her! Don't leave her alive! Anyone who stops now answers to me." The attack became uncontrollable, a frenzy of violence. Kicks, punches, iron bars, all rained down on one solitary soldier. Her uniform was torn, exposing bloody wounds beneath. Blood dripped onto the ground, forming dark pools in the dust that reflected the harsh sunlight. She fought with everything she had, her training allowing her to block some blows, to deflect others, but the numbers were overwhelming. Citizens watched from a distance, hidden behind shutters and doors. Many hid in fear, terrified of becoming the next target. Some pulled out their mobile phones and began recording videos. The attack was being documented, captured in digital memory, but no one dared to intervene. The fear that Benjol had cultivated over months held them paralyzed. Through the pain and chaos, Alia's mind remained focused. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for what her survival would mean. If she fell here, if Benjol won this confrontation, the message would echo through every town in Burkina Faso. Resist and die. But if she could hold on, if help could arrive, then perhaps this moment could become something different. A turning point, a line in the sand beyond which the darkness could not pass. Meanwhile, at headquarters, the alarm bell rang with urgent intensity, its metallic clang cutting through the afternoon heat. A soldier named Samuel ran breathlessly to Ibrahim Traoré's office, his face flushed with exertion and concern. He burst through the door without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately told Traoré something was seriously wrong. "Sir, there's an attack happening in the Western District. Lieutenant Alia went on patrol alone, and now she's surrounded. The gang, they're beating her, sir. Witnesses are calling it in." Traoré, who had been bent over maps planning the week's security operations, stood up straight immediately. A wave of anger crossed his face like a thunderstorm rolling across the savannah. His jaw clenched, and his eyes blazed with a fury that his soldiers had rarely seen. He roared, "A daughter of our army has been attacked, and you're reporting to me instead of mobilizing. Sound the alarm! Prepare the cavalry now!" The alarm sounded. Throughout headquarters, its wailing cry galvanizing every soldier into action. The mounted unit, which Traoré had insisted on maintaining, despite criticism that it was outdated, sprang into action. From the stables came the neighing and whinnying of horses, sensing the urgency of their riders. Soldiers began fastening their gear with practiced efficiency, saddles checked, weapons secured, minds focused. Ibrahim Traoré himself strode to the stables, his long legs covering ground rapidly. He mounted his horse, a powerful stallion named Lightning that he had ridden into countless operations. Dressed in his dress uniform, wearing his gleaming beret, with its eagle insignia with flames of determination in his eyes, he cut an imposing figure. "Mount up," he commanded, and within minutes, dozens of soldiers were on horseback, forming ranks with military precision. He addressed them, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled force. "Today, we ride not just for a soldier, but for the soul of our nation. Lieutenant Alia stands alone against those who would tear down everything we've built. She is our sister, our daughter, our comrade, and no daughter of Burkina Faso stands alone. We will show these criminals that when they attack one of us, they face all of us. But remember, we are soldiers, not murderers. We will use only the force necessary. We represent the law, and we will act lawfully. Now ride!" The mounted unit thundered forward, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm like war drums. The citizens of Calatin, hearing the sound, emerged from their homes and shops. Children pointed excitedly. Women clasped their hands in hope. Men stood straighter, feeling pride stir in their chests. On the other side of the city, Alia's breathing was labored and shallow. She lay on the ground, battered and bleeding, her uniform torn and soaked with blood. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly broken. Her vision swam and she struggled to maintain consciousness. But from her lips came one word, barely a whisper. "Come." Benjol bent down and spoke with venomous satisfaction, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You see, this is your fate. You're a woman, not a soldier. You should have stayed home, cooking and cleaning, like nature intended. He pressed his boot against her face, grinding it into the dirt with deliberate cruelty, savoring his victory. His men cheered, their voices hoarse with excitement. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion of sound echoed through the air, cutting through the cheers like a knife. Sirens wailed, the ground began to tremble, a vibration that grew stronger by the second. From somewhere distant came the thundering sound of horses, dozens of them, moving as one in perfect synchronization. Benjol turned around in shock, his foot lifting from Alia's face. Through the clouds of dust emerged gleaming uniforms, and the green, red, and yellow flag of Burkina Faso, rippling magnificently in the wind. At the head of the formation rode Ibrahim Traoré, his figure silhouetted against the sun like an avenging angel. "What is that coming?" one gang member screamed in terror, his voice cracking. Alia, despite her pain, managed a weak smile. In a voice barely audible but filled with certainty, she said, "This is your end, and that man never strays from the path of justice." The dust intensified as the cavalry drew closer. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder and louder, like thunder approaching across the plain, like the heartbeat of the nation itself. The color drained from Benjol's face as the reality of the situation became clear. Ibrahim Traoré's force was on its way, and today, justice itself was riding on horseback, swift and inexorable. The gang members, so confident moments before, now looked at each other with growing panic. Some began backing away, others dropped their weapons. The tables had turned, and they knew it. The atmosphere at headquarters had erupted like a lightning bolt when the siren sounded, but now that energy had been channeled into focused, disciplined action. The stable doors had flown open, and horses' hooves thundered against the ground, making it tremble with each powerful stride. Soldiers ran out in formation, their uniforms crisp despite the dust, their faces set with determination. At the head of them all, mounted on his powerful stallion, was Ibrahim Traoré, that name which represented courage and honor for every soldier in the country. His face held a steady composure, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. His lips were set in that particular expression of controlled fury that is more dangerous than any storm. He had seen too much in his career, too much corruption, too much violence, too much suffering of innocent people, and he had vowed that under his watch justice would prevail. As they rode through the streets, citizens emerged to watch. An old woman, who remembered the chaos of previous years, wept with relief. A young boy saluted as the cavalry passed, dreaming of the day he might wear that uniform. Shopkeepers came to their doorways, and slowly, spontaneously, applause began. It started with one person, then another, then dozens, until the sound of clapping hands merged with the thunder of hooves. Traoré raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement, but never slowed his pace. Every second counted. Alia was alone, facing danger, and he would not fail her. The cavalry reached the Western District in record time. As they rounded the final corner, the scene became visible. Alia on the ground, surrounded by gang members, blood pooling beneath her. Benjol standing over her with his boot raised for another blow. The motorcycles scattered around like discarded toys. Traoré's voice boomed across the square, amplified by the speaker system they had brought. "Halt! This is the armed forces of Burkina Faso. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The gang members froze. Some dropped their chains and pipes immediately. Others looked to Benjol, uncertain, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Benjol himself stood paralyzed, caught between his pride and his survival instinct. He had built his entire identity on being feared, on being untouchable. But now, facing the full force of the nation's military, led by a legend like Ibrahim Traoré, he realized how hollow that power had been. The cavalry formed a perfect circle around the scene, cutting off all escape routes. Traoré dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. his boots hitting the ground with authority. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Benjol's face. "You," he said, his voice now quiet but somehow more menacing than when he had shouted. "You thought you could terrorize this city without consequences. You thought you could assault a soldier of Burkina Faso and walk away. You were wrong." Benjol tried to muster his earlier confidence. "Who are you to threaten me, old man? I run this city." Traoré smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You run nothing. You are a parasite feeding on fear. But fear only works when people are alone. And we," he gestured to the soldiers surrounding them, "are never alone." He knelt beside Aliyah, gently checking her injuries. "Can you stand, Lieutenant?" Aliyah's voice was weak but determined. "With help, sir." 2 medics rushed forward with a stretcher, carefully lifting her onto it. As they carried her past Benjol, she looked directly at him and said, "This is what happens when courage faces cowardice. Courage always wins." Traoré stood and faced the gang members. "All of you, on your knees, hands behind your heads. You are under arrest for assault on a military officer, terrorism, and numerous other crimes that will be detailed in court." One by one they complied. Only Benjol remained standing, his pride fighting his sense of self-preservation. "On your knees," Traoré repeated, his voice harder now. Finally, slowly, Benjol sank to his knees. The symbolic gesture sent a ripple through the watching crowd. The man who had terrorized them for so long was kneeling in the dust, defeated not by greater violence, but by the lawful authority of a nation that had finally said, "Enough." Soldiers moved forward with restraints, binding the prisoners with professional efficiency. The watching citizens began to emerge from their hiding places, first tentatively, then with growing confidence. An elderly man approached Traoré and grasped his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you for showing us that the law still matters." Traoré squeezed his hand. "The law has always mattered, my friend. We just needed to remember that." As the prisoners were loaded into military vehicles and Aliyah was rushed to the medical facility, Traoré surveyed the scene. The Western District, which had witnessed so much fear, was beginning to fill with people celebrating, embracing, laughing with relief. Children ran through the streets chanting, "The soldiers saved us! The soldiers saved us!" But Traoré knew this was just the beginning. Capturing the gang was one thing. Transforming a society that had allowed such gangs to flourish was another. That would require not just military action, but education, economic opportunity, and a fundamental renewal of civic spirit. He mounted his horse again and addressed the crowd that had gathered. "Today, we have removed a cancer from our community, but the healing process now begins. We need all of you, teachers, parents, business owners, young people, to work together to ensure that gangs like this can never take root again. Justice is not just the responsibility of soldiers. It is the responsibility of every citizen." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. "Long live General Traoré! Long live Lieutenant Aliyah! Long live Burkina Faso!" As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Traoré looked at the flag flying above the headquarters in the distance. Today, that flag stood a little taller, its colors a little brighter. Today, Burkina Faso had proven that courage and justice could overcome fear and violence. But the story was far from over. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as they worked to transform not just the gang members, but the society that had produced them. Days passed after that historic confrontation, and Calatin began the slow process of healing. The old warehouse where Benjol's gang once held their celebrations had been reduced to ashes in a controlled burn, a symbolic cleansing of the evil that had festered there. But the real transformation was happening in the hearts of the people. Lieutenant Aliyah spent 3 days in the hospital. She had sustained a broken arm, multiple contusions, and a concussion, but the doctors marveled at her resilience. Soldiers came to visit her in shifts, bringing flowers and words of encouragement. But the most moving visits came from the women and girls of Calatin, who came to tell her that she had inspired them, had shown them that they too could be strong. One young girl, no more than 12, sat by her bedside and said, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." Lieutenant Alia, despite her pain, smiled warmly. "Be better than me, child. Be kinder, wiser, more compassionate. But never ever let anyone tell you that you cannot do something because you are a woman." Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the trial. Within weeks, a military court was convened in a room near headquarters. The proceedings would be public, a deliberate decision by Traoré to show transparency and build public trust. Military and civilian judges were present, representing both the authority of the armed forces and the interests of the civilian population. Outside, hundreds of people had gathered. Students, laborers, women, even children who had participated in Alia's school programs. People held small flags in their hands, and on their lips was a single chant, "Justice, not revenge." The atmosphere inside the courtroom was solemn, almost church-like in its gravity. The wooden benches were packed with observers. Journalists from across West Africa had come to cover the trial, sensing its broader significance. This was not just about one gang in one city. It was about whether a nation could transform violence through justice rather than responding with greater violence. Benjol was brought in wearing handcuffs, flanked by 2 guards. The man who had once strutted with arrogance now walked with his eyes cast down. His hair was disheveled, his face bore the marks of his own violence turned back upon him, and his eyes showed exhaustion, and perhaps for the first time in his life, something resembling genuine fear. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Aminata Kone, who had presided over some of the nation's most important cases, looked down at him from the bench. She was known for her fairness, her incorruptibility, and her belief that the law existed to protect the weak from the strong. She opened a thick file and began reading the charges. Benjol Amadou, you are charged with assault on a military officer, terrorism, extortion, assault causing bodily harm on at least 15 occasions, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit murder. How do you plead? The courtroom fell silent, every person leaning forward to hear his response. Benjol raised his head slowly. He looked around the courtroom, at the faces of people he had terrorized, at the soldiers he had attacked, at the judges who held his fate in their hands. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was different from the boastful roar of before. It was quiet, almost broken. I plead guilty to all charges. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge raised her hand for silence. Benjol continued, I made a mistake. I was blinded by the intoxication of power. I thought fear brought respect, that violence made me strong. But today I've learned that respect comes only from justice, and real strength comes from restraint. I have hurt many people. I have terrorized this city. And I am sorry. His voice broke on the last word. Several of his former gang members sitting in the gallery began to cry. Whatever they had expected from this trial, this moment of raw vulnerability was not it. Silence fell over the courtroom. Justice Kone studied Benjol's face carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or deception. She had seen many criminals claim remorse to reduce their sentences, but something in this young man's demeanor suggested genuine transformation. Still, she was not naive. Remorse did not erase harm. Your guilty plea is noted, she said. But before I pass sentence, this court will hear testimony from those you have harmed. Over the next several hours, a parade of witnesses took the stand. The elderly shopkeeper who had been beaten spoke of the permanent injury to his hands that could no longer perform the delicate work of his trade. A mother whose son had been recruited into the gang at 14 wept as she described watching her child become a stranger, violent and cold. A young woman testified about being extorted for protection money she couldn't afford, forcing her to close the small hair salon that had been her dream. Through it all, Benjol listened with his head bowed. Each testimony seemed to add weight to his shoulders, bending him further forward until he appeared to be collapsing inward. Finally, Ibrahim Traoré himself took the stand. The courtroom fell completely silent. Everyone knew that his testimony would carry enormous weight. General Traoré, Justice Kone began, you witnessed the attack on Lieutenant Alia and led the response. What is your view on this case? Traoré stood, his uniform immaculate, his bearing proud. But when he spoke, his words surprised many. Your Honor, what Benjol and his gang did was reprehensible and deserving of punishment. But I also believe we as a society have failed these young men. We have failed to provide them with education, with economic opportunities, with a sense of purpose beyond survival. Benjol is guilty, yes, but we are also guilty of creating the conditions in which such gangs can flourish. He turned to look directly at Benjol. You have done terrible things. You have hurt innocent people, terrorized this city, and attacked one of my finest soldiers. For that you must face consequences. But I also believe in redemption. I believe that even you can change, can become a productive member of society. The question is, do you have the courage to try? Benjol raised his head, meeting Traoré's eyes for the first time. I do, sir. If you give me the chance, I will spend the rest of my life making amends. After 3 days of testimony and deliberation, Justice Kone delivered her verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding near the doors. Benjol Amadou, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. You have been found guilty of serious crimes against the people of Burkina Faso. Under normal sentencing guidelines, you would face 15 to 20 years in prison. However, this court recognizes several mitigating factors: your genuine remorse, your willingness to cooperate fully with authorities, and General Traoré's testimony regarding systemic failures that contributed to your criminal behavior. She paused, letting the tension build. Therefore, this court sentences you to 7 years in prison, with the possibility of early release after 4 years if you successfully complete our new rehabilitation program. This program will include education, vocational training, and intensive counseling. You will learn a trade, earn your high school diploma, and most importantly, learn to be a productive citizen. Relief and disappointment mixed in the courtroom. Relief from those who believed in rehabilitation. Disappointment from those who wanted harsher punishment. Justice Kone continued. But understand this, Mr. Amadou, this is not leniency. This is a chance. If you waste it, if you return to your old ways, the full weight of the law will crush you. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Benjol replied, his voice steady. I understand, and I will not waste this chance. The other gang members received similar sentences, tailored to their individual levels of involvement. Young Ibrahim, the 15-year-old, received only probation and mandatory schooling, his youth and minimal involvement earning him mercy. As the court adjourned, something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Alia, who had been watching from a wheelchair in the gallery, her arm still in a cast, raised her hand. Your Honor, may I address the court? Justice Kone nodded. Lieutenant, you may speak. Alia wheeled herself forward, and 2 soldiers helped position her where everyone could see. She looked at Benjol and his gang members, many of whom couldn't meet her eyes. I have spent the past 3 weeks in pain, she began. Physical pain from my injuries, but also emotional pain, wondering why this happened, what I could have done differently. But I've come to understand something important. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Violence begets violence. If we respond to your hatred with more hatred, to your violence with more violence, the cycle never ends. So I want you to know I forgive you, not because what you did was acceptable, but because forgiveness is the only way forward. I hope that during your rehabilitation you will find a better path. And when you emerge, I hope you will help other young people avoid the mistakes you made. Tears streamed down Benjol's face. Several of his gang members openly sobbed. Even some of the hardened soldiers in the room had to wipe their eyes. At that moment, Ibrahim Traoré stood up. He approached the bench and addressed Justice Kone. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to make an announcement. Proceed, General. Traoré turned to face the gallery. Today, we have shown the world that Burkina Faso believes in justice tempered with mercy. But words mean nothing without action. Therefore, I am announcing the creation of the National Rehabilitation Initiative. This program will work with prisoners like Benjol to provide education, job training, psychological counseling, and reintegration support. We will give them the tools they need to build honest, productive lives. He gestured toward Alia. Furthermore, Lieutenant Alia has agreed to serve as the program's director once she recovers. She will oversee the transformation of these young men and women from criminals into citizens. The courtroom erupted in applause. People stood, cheering and crying. Benjol fell to his knees, overwhelmed by emotion. The scene was captured by dozens of cameras, and within hours, it would be broadcast across Africa and the world. Justice Kone smiled, a rare sight in her courtroom, and banged her gavel. This court is adjourned. May God bless Burkina Faso and all who work for justice. As people filed out of the courtroom, an elderly man approached Traoré. General, what you did today, showing mercy while demanding accountability, that is true leadership. Traoré shook his hand. Justice without mercy is cruelty, but mercy without justice is weakness. We must find the balance. That evening, as the sun set over Calatin, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Ibrahim Traoré and Lieutenant Alia sat together on the balcony of headquarters. Below them, the city was alive with celebration. Music played in the streets, children danced, and for the first time in years, people felt safe. Do you really think they can change? Alia asked, referring to Benjol and his gang. Traoré was quiet for a moment. Some will, some won't. But if we don't give them the chance, we guarantee they'll return to crime. Hope is always a gamble, Lieutenant, but it's the only gamble worth taking. Alia nodded, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated her injuries. Then I'll do everything in my power to make sure that hope isn't wasted. I know you will, Traoré said. That's why I chose you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their city begin to heal. 3 months had passed since the trial, and the transformation of Calatin was remarkable. The rehabilitation program had begun in earnest, and to the surprise of many skeptics, it was working. Benjol and his former gang members spent their days in a structured environment, mornings devoted to education, afternoons to vocational training, evenings to counseling and reflection. Lieutenant Alia, fully recovered from her injuries, threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity. She had transformed the old textile factory, the same warehouse where the gang had once plotted violence, into a rehabilitation center. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. On this particular morning, she stood before a classroom of 30 young men, most of them former gang members. They sat at desks that had been donated by local businesses, wearing simple blue uniforms that marked them as participants in the program. "Good morning," Alia said. "Good morning, Lieutenant," they replied in unison, voices that had once hurled insults now respectful and attentive. "Today, we're going to talk about leadership," she continued. "Real leadership, not the false authority that comes from fear. Who can tell me the difference?" A hand went up. It was young Ibrahim, the 15-year-old who had been given probation. He had become one of the program's success stories, attending school during the day and helping with the rehabilitation program in the evenings. "Lieutenant, I think real leadership is about making people better, not just making them obey." Alia smiled. "Excellent. Real leaders inspire, guide, and elevate those around them. False leaders like Benjol used to be, no offense, Benjol, simply intimidate and control." Benjol, sitting in the front row, nodded without shame. "No offense taken, Lieutenant. You're right. I wasn't a leader. I was a tyrant." Over the past 3 months, Benjol had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. He had earned his high school diploma through intensive study, was learning carpentry in the vocational program, and had begun writing a memoir about his experiences, hoping it might prevent other young people from following his path. "Exactly," Alia continued. "And that's what we're trying to teach you here, how to be real leaders in your communities. Because when you leave this program, people will watch you. Some will expect you to fail, to return to your old ways. You have the opportunity to prove them wrong." After the lesson, as the students filed out for lunch, Benjol lingered. "Lieutenant, can I speak with you?" "Of course, Benjol. What's on your mind?" He fidgeted nervously, a far cry from the arrogant gang leader he had once been. "I've been thinking a lot about what I did to you, the attack, the violence, and I realize that saying sorry isn't enough. Words are easy. So I wanted to ask, is there any way I can make real amends?" Alia considered the question carefully. "Actually, there is. In 2 weeks, we're hosting a community forum where former gang members will share their stories with at-risk youth. I'd like you to speak, honestly, openly, about your experiences and what you've learned. Benjol paled. In front of the whole community? The people I terrorized? Yes. It will be difficult. Perhaps the hardest thing you've ever done. But if you can stand before them, admit what you did, and show them who you've become, that would be real amends. Benjol swallowed hard, then nodded. I'll do it. Meanwhile, across town, General Ibrahim Traoré was meeting with government ministers, business leaders, and education officials. The success of the Calatin rehabilitation program had attracted national attention, and now they were discussing how to expand it throughout Burkina Faso. General, said the Minister of Education, your program is achieving remarkable results. But how do we scale it? We have limited resources and hundreds of young people in need. Traoré leaned forward. We start by changing how we think about these young people. They're not irredeemable criminals. They're victims of failed systems. Most grew up in poverty with inadequate schools, few job opportunities, and no positive role models. We created the conditions that produced gangs like the Road Kings. Now we must create the conditions that prevent new gangs from forming. He outlined his vision: comprehensive education reform, job training programs, mentorship initiatives pairing at-risk youth with successful adults, community centers offering sports and arts programs, and economic development in neglected neighborhoods. This isn't just about punishing criminals, he continued. It's about building a society where crime becomes unnecessary because everyone has a legitimate path to dignity and prosperity. The Minister of Finance raised a concern. General, this sounds expensive. Where will we find the funding? Traoré smiled. Think of it as an investment. Right now, we spend millions on policing, courts, and prisons. We spend even more on the economic costs of crime, lost productivity, damaged property, medical care for victims. If we can prevent even 30% of young people from entering criminal life, the program will pay for itself within 5 years. The room fell silent as the officials absorbed this logic. Finally, the president's chief of staff spoke. The president is very interested in this initiative, General. He wants to visit Calatin next month to see the program firsthand. Can you arrange that? It would be my honor, Traoré replied. 2 weeks later, the community forum took place in Calatin's central square. A stage had been erected, with hundreds of chairs arranged in front of it. As evening approached, people began to arrive, families, young people, elders, everyone curious to hear what the former gang members had to say. Aaliyah opened the forum with brief remarks, then introduced the first speaker, Malik, one of Benjol's former lieutenants. He walked to the microphone nervously, cleared his throat, and began. My name is Malik, and I was a member of the Road Kings. I helped extort money from many of you. I stood by while people were beaten. I am deeply ashamed of what I did. He paused, his voice breaking. But I want you to understand how I got there. I'm not making excuses, just explaining. I grew up in the East Side, where there are no jobs, where the school had no books, where my father left when I was 6, and my mother worked 3 jobs just to feed us. By the time I was 14, I was angry at the world. When Benjol offered me a place in his gang, it felt like the first time anyone had valued me. He looked directly at the audience. I was wrong. Violence and crime aren't the answer to poverty and neglect. But until we had other options, until Lieutenant Alia and General Traoré showed us a different path, we didn't know how else to survive. Now I'm learning carpentry. I'm going to build houses instead of destroying lives. And I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I've done. The audience was silent. Then one person began to clap. Then another. Soon, much of the crowd was applauding, not approval of his past actions, but appreciation for his honesty and his commitment to change. Several more former gang members spoke, each sharing their story, each earning a mixture of skepticism and hope from the audience. Finally, Benjol approached the microphone. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the man they had feared most, the one whose name had kept children awake at night. He stood at the microphone for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then he began. I am Benjol, and I am the reason many of you couldn't sleep at night. I am the reason some of you closed your businesses. I am the reason parents kept their children inside. I terrorized this community, and I nearly killed Lieutenant Aliyah, a woman who had never done anything except try to protect you." His voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "I wish I could tell you there was a good reason for what I did, but there wasn't. I was angry, I was hurt, and I chose to hurt others instead of healing myself. I built an empire on fear because I was terrified that I was worthless, that I would never matter, that the world would crush me if I didn't crush it first." He looked out at the faces in the crowd, many of them people he had personally victimized. "I know that sorry isn't enough. I know that my transformation doesn't undo your trauma, but I want you to know that I see you now, really see you, as human beings who suffered because of my choices, and I promise you on my life that I will never hurt anyone again. I am learning to build instead of destroy. I am learning to lead through service instead of fear, and I hope that one day you might be able to forgive me." He stepped back from the microphone, and complete silence reigned. Then from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "I forgive you!" It was the elderly shopkeeper whose hands had been broken. He stood, leaning on a cane, tears streaming down his face. "I forgive you because hate is a prison and I choose freedom. But don't waste this second chance, young man. Make it count." Benjol nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. More voices called out, some offering forgiveness, some expressing continued anger, all of them processing complex emotions. The forum had created a space for honesty, for pain to be acknowledged and healing to begin. As the evening concluded, Aliyah stood at the microphone one final time. "What we've witnessed tonight is the beginning of something important. Not everyone will forgive, not everyone will trust, but we've started a conversation, and conversations lead to understanding, and understanding leads to healing. Thank you all for coming, for listening, and for being part of this community's transformation." The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to talk, to process, to connect. In small groups throughout the square, conversations were happening. Former victims speaking with former victimizers, finding their common humanity. General Traoré, watching from the side of the stage, felt a warmth in his chest. This was what victory really looked like. Not the dramatic moment of the cavalry charge, but the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust and community. He approached Aliyah as she descended from the stage. "You did well tonight, Lieutenant. This is harder work than combat, but more important." She smiled wearily. "It's exhausting, sir, but it's worth it. Did you see Benjol's face when that shopkeeper forgave him? That's when I knew we might actually succeed." "We will succeed," Traoré said with conviction. "Because we're not just changing individuals, we're changing the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a nation." The following month brought the promised presidential visit. The president of Burkina Faso arrived in Calatin with his entourage, and the entire city turned out to greet him. But this was not a typical political photo opportunity. The president spent the entire day touring the rehabilitation center, speaking with participants, observing classes, and listening to their stories. He was particularly moved by a woodworking class where former gang members were crafting furniture that would be donated to local schools. Benjol, demonstrating his growing skills, presented the president with a hand-carved desk. "Your Excellency," Benjol said, "this desk represents what we've learned, that our hands can create beauty instead of destruction. Thank you for supporting this program." The president accepted the desk with visible emotion. "Young man, you represent the hope of our nation. Every young person who turns away from crime and toward productivity makes Burkina Faso stronger." That evening, at a formal ceremony in the central square, the president made a historic announcement. With Lieutenant Aliyah and General Traoré standing beside him, he declared that the Calatin rehabilitation model would be implemented nationwide. Furthermore, he unveiled the Aliyah Initiative, a scholarship program for young women pursuing military, service, or law enforcement careers. Lieutenant Aliyah showed us that courage knows no gender, the president proclaimed. She stood alone against violence and inspired a nation. Now we will ensure that every girl in Burkina Faso knows she can be a leader, a protector, a hero. The crowd erupted in cheers. Young girls in the audience looked at Alia with stars in their eyes, seeing in her a reflection of their own potential. But perhaps the most significant moment came after the official speeches, when the president invited Benjol to speak briefly. This was controversial. Some advisors argued that giving a platform to a former criminal sent the wrong message. But the president overruled them. Benjol approached the microphone with humility. "Your Excellency, honored guests, people of Calatin, I stand before you not as an example to follow, but as a warning of what happens when we lose our way, and as proof that people can change. 6 months ago, I was this city's nightmare. Today, thanks to the mercy of Lieutenant Alia, the wisdom of General Traoré, and the faith of this community, I am becoming a contributing citizen. If I can change, anyone can. No one is beyond redemption." His words were broadcast on national television, and the image of a former gang leader speaking at a presidential event, transformed and humble, became one of the defining moments of Burkina Faso's modern history. Years passed. The rehabilitation program exceeded all expectations. Recidivism rates, the percentage of people who returned to crime, dropped to just 12%, compared to nearly 70% before the program began. The young men and women who completed the program went on to become carpenters, electricians, teachers, even police officers. They became the program's best advocates, visiting schools to warn students away from gang life and sharing their stories of transformation. Benjol himself became a certified counselor, working full-time at the rehabilitation center, guiding new participants through the same journey he had traveled. He never forgot what he had done, never let himself off the hook, but he channeled his guilt into purpose. Young Ibrahim, the 15-year-old who had been spared prison, graduated at the top of his high school class and earned a scholarship to university. He studied social work and returned to Calatin to work alongside Alia in the rehabilitation program. The circle of redemption was complete. Lieutenant Alia continued to rise through the ranks, eventually becoming Colonel Alia, the first woman to reach that rank in Burkina Faso's military. But she never left her rehabilitation work, balancing her military duties with her commitment to the program she had built. She became a national icon, featured on stamps and currency, but she remained remarkably humble, always insisting that she was simply one person who had been in the right place at the right time. General Ibrahim Traoré, approaching retirement age, could look back on a distinguished career, but when asked about his greatest achievement, he never mentioned his military victories or his strategic brilliance. Instead, he always said, "My greatest achievement was learning that true strength lies not in the ability to defeat enemies, but in the ability to transform them into allies." The rehabilitation center in Calatin, built in that old textile factory, became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Delegations from across Africa and beyond came to study the model, to understand how a small city in Burkina Faso had achieved what so many others had failed to do: break the cycle of violence through justice tempered with mercy. On the 10th anniversary of the confrontation that had changed everything, a special ceremony was held. A monument was erected in the central square, a bronze statue depicting Lieutenant Alia standing firm, but with her hand extended not in violence, but in welcome. The inscription read, "Courage is standing for what is right. Wisdom is offering redemption to those who were wrong. May we always have the courage and wisdom to do both." Alia, Traoré, and yes, Benjol all spoke at the ceremony. The shopkeeper, whose hands had been broken by the gang, was there, now reconciled with his attackers. Families whose lives had been terrorized stood alongside the young men who had terrorized them, bound now not by fear but by shared commitment to a better future. As the sun set on that anniversary day, painting the sky in brilliant golds and crimsons, a group of children played in the square beneath the new monument. They played without fear, with the unself-conscious joy that comes only from genuine security. Colonel Alia, watching them, turned to General Traoré. "Sir, do you think it will last? This peace we've built?" Traoré, his hair now silvered with age but his eyes still bright with purpose, smiled. "Peace is not a destination, Colonel. It's a practice. Every day we choose it. Every day we work for it. And yes, I believe it will last because we've taught a new generation not just to value peace, but to build it actively. He gestured to the playing children. They don't remember when this square was a place of fear. For them, this is normal. Safety, opportunity, hope. That's the greatest gift we can give, a generation that can't imagine living any other way. That night, as lights twinkled across Kalatin and families gathered for evening meals, as students studied and workers rested and children dreamed, the flag of Burkina Faso waved gently over the headquarters. Its colors, red for the revolution, green for hope and abundance, yellow for prosperity, seemed to glow in the lamplight, and in a small office in the rehabilitation center, Benjol sat writing in his journal, a practice he had maintained for 10 years. His entry that night read, "Anniversary of the day I nearly killed Lieutenant Alia. Anniversary of the day I died and was reborn. I think of the man I was, angry, violent, lost, and I barely recognize him. But I can't forget him either. He is part of my story, the dark chapter that makes the later ones meaningful. Today I helped a new participant, a kid who reminds me of myself at that age. I told him what Lieutenant Alia told me. You are not your worst moment. You are what you choose to become starting right now." He cried like I cried, but I think he heard me. I think he might make it. And if he makes it, he'll help someone else make it. And that's how we heal a nation, one transformed heart at a time. He closed the journal, turned off the light, and walked out into the Kalatin night. Somewhere in the distance, a voice was singing. The melody drifted through the streets, carrying with it all the pain and hope and hard-won wisdom of a community that had stared into darkness and chosen, together, to walk toward the light. This was Burkina Faso, imperfect, still struggling with poverty and corruption and all the challenges that face developing nations. But here, in this small city, they had proven something profound, that justice and mercy are not opposites but partners. That courage means standing for principles even when outnumbered. That redemption is possible for those willing to do the hard work of change. And that true leadership measures success not by enemies defeated, but by former enemies transformed into allies. The story of Lieutenant Alia and General Traoré, of Benjol's fall and redemption, of a community that chose healing over revenge, became legend. But it was a living legend, one enacted daily by every person who chose to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to hope rather than despair. And every evening, as the sun set over Burkina Faso, mothers told their children the story, not as ancient history but as a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that darkness can be defeated, and that the greatest victories come not from the power to destroy but from the courage to build, to forgive and to believe in redemption. The flag continued to wave, a symbol not just of a nation but of a promise that justice will prevail, that mercy will heal, and that courage will always find its moment. The end.